Few days ago, there was a stress test for Nightingale, which has been at or near the top of my wish list for more than 2 years now since I first came across the game. Nightingale is a survival game set in a steampunk world where you hop from realm to realm, encountering various types of biomes, new types of creatures, and gathering new resources and stuff like that. So that's the main gameplay loop of the game. So what I want to do in this video is talk about why, after the stress test, I'm a bit concerned about this game, I'm even more concerned now by the fact that they're actually moving up the release date by a couple of days. It was originally scheduled for February 22nd. It's now scheduled for February 20th. And by the end of this video, you might understand why I think the game needs more, maybe needs another year or two in the oven before it's released. So first up, it was a stress test, so I'm not going to judge it based on the performance. Unfortunately, the footage I did capture, I can't even show because it was really framey. And I think that just had to do with the fact that it was a stress test. And I'd heard other people that were recording it had similar issues. So not sure about that. I'm not going to judge on the performance. For me personally, it was a little choppy from time to time. There was some stuttering and stuff like that. I am playing on a 4090 with a i9-13900K and 64 gigs of RAM, so I have a high-end PC. So for me, I shouldn't have had any performance issues, but I know others were playing it on mid-tier PCs, and they were only getting like 30 to 40 frames. But like I said, we're not going to judge the performance because it was a stress test, although I do want to provide a caveat that from what I saw, I think there was only 8 or 10,000 players at peak, somewhere around there in the stress test. So if this game has way more than that on release day, performance could be a bit of an issue, but we'll have to see what happens with that in the future. Now, looking at the game, like I said, the footage in the background is going to be from the trailers that have been released by the developers. The game, to me, looks a little bit graphically dated when I compare it to games I've played recently, like Enshrouded, which just seems a lot more polished. I'm not a graphics snob, so I'm not going to judge it too harshly on that. But the graphics for it, I think, especially coming from a developer that has lots of former AAA experience, could have looked a little bit better. The realm system that I mentioned briefly before is the main feature of the game, and what you do is you craft cards and you can create portals that will take you to different realms. The different realms are essentially just new biomes that will have new creatures, new resources, and stuff like that for you to explore and gather. And at first glance, I thought this was a really cool, unique mechanic for the game, and perhaps it is. But after having thought about it a little bit more, I think the reason they might have done that was just to for technical reasons, because rather than it being a large open world that you would normally expect in a survival game, it's going to be instance where you hop from realm to realm, and each realm is like a separate little chunk. So maybe that was the reason they did it. Maybe it wasn't. I'm not sure, but that's kind of just the impression I got from it. One of the big things that I personally had issue with, and everybody else I know that played the stress test had issue with, was navigating the menus in the game. They were really cumbersome. It wasn't just intuitive on how to do them. Part of this might have been the fact that you were thrown into the game, like I think somewhere maybe like 5 to 10 hours into it. So it wasn't from the start. There were no tutorials on how to navigate things. I'm not like that big into being handheld in games, but typically in a game, you can kind of figure out like how things work without too much trouble. Navigating the menus in this game and just navigating through all the systems was really, really cumbersome, and hopefully that's something they can streamline, or maybe the tutorials will solve that and make it a little bit easier. Next, I want to talk about the crafting. So a survival game wouldn't be a survival game without crafting. The crafting times in this game for some of the items, to me, felt more egregious than they did in Power World, and that was one of the big things I had issues with in Power World. In Power World, you can use your pals to expedite the crafting process, especially if you get higher tier pals. They can craft things much faster than you can. In this game, everything just had like long timers, and it felt like they just felt egregiously long for a lot of the items. So that's something that could be fixed by just having the numbers reduced. Maybe they'll provide in-game sliders to change that kind of stuff. Hopefully they do, because that goes along with the next thing I want to talk about, which for a survival game, my opinion of this, and everybody I talked to, all the friends that played the stress test, agreed that the game felt extremely grindy even for a survival game. Now, survival games by nature are typically grindy. They have grindy systems in them. Got to get a bunch of resources, got to go out and do a bunch of exploring, maybe got to kill a bunch of enemies, so on and so forth. Everything in this game felt extra grindy, all the way down to like the durability, where the durability on your gear felt like it was used up rather quickly, but repairing it was not too expensive. The resource for repairing it was readily available, but it was just having to go in and click 3 or 4 screens just to get to the part to repair it. Just made no sense. It was almost like, why even have it in the game at that point? But everything about the game just felt like overly grindy, and I feel like that could be a turnoff for people, especially if it doesn't have the sliders that you can get in games like Power World, which is something I think all games should have at this point, where you can customize your experience. So if you want a super grindy game and you want to spend 1,000 hours doing something and someone else wants to only spend 10 hours doing it, you should be able to do that. So hopefully they have features like that in the game where you can kind of customize how grindy things are and how much they aren't. Next up, I want to talk about the thing that the last two things I want to talk about. These are the things that were the most concerning to me. The movement felt really, really slow. I felt like I was moving in slow motion. Now, part of this might have been because it was first person. Another part of it might have been because I'd recently put 60 plus hours into Enshrouded, which is a third person action survival game where the movement felt really fluid. It felt like really quick, and you just felt like you got around the map really fast, especially with the grappling hook and the glider and stuff like that. So movement felt really, really smooth in that game and really good. In the little bit of time that I played the stress test, the movement in this game felt really sluggish. I almost felt like I was walking in quicksand the entire time, and I just felt like getting around just took way too long. The combat and the enemy AI were the thing that I'm most concerned about. The combat felt super floaty. The movement felt super floaty. The enemy AI, I can't say it's the worst enemy AI I've ever seen in a video game, because obviously there's shovelware games that come out all the time that just have abysmal AI. It doesn't even exist. But for a game with developers, with the experience they've had on previous games, the AI in this game, I would give it an F. It was absolutely the worst enemy AI I've ever seen in a game of what I would say this quality, or what I was expecting for this quality. To be a AA or AAA game, the enemies would do one of a couple of things. One, they would just get stuck on literally everything. They would get stuck on the smallest things, and you could just sit there and kill them. Two, they would just stand there brain dead and walk into walls and not move or even react to you. Three, you could avoid their attacks pretty easily just by moving around, and they wouldn't be able to hit you. It was just, the combat for the game felt so much worse than the combat in Enshrouded, which felt more fluid and where you could actually block and dodge, and everything just felt really responsive. Everything about the combat in this game felt like a game that was made maybe 10 years ago by someone, and this was their very first game making it. And that is really concerning to me. So that was my experience with the stress test for Nightingale. I didn't spend a terrible amount of time in it. I saw all the features I wanted to see. I didn't want to spoil too much. I did play an alpha test for the game last year that was under NDA that I was not allowed to talk about. I'm only talking about what I've actually experienced in this stress test. Again, I'm not going to judge it too harshly on the performance because it was a stress test. I am a bit concerned that they've moved up a release date. My sentiment about this game and my overall impressions were it felt like a game that was super early access, that was really not ready for release. And I honestly think it could use another year or two in development before it's released. The fact that they're moving it up a couple days, I almost wonder if they're moving up from a Thursday to a Tuesday. I'm almost wondering if they didn't want to get bombarded over the weekend with having to fix issues or deal with problems, because everybody I talked to that played this game felt like the game is way too early to be released and that it just needs more time in the oven. So for me, I'm going to probably take a wait and see approach. I'm going to see how the game performs on the 20th when it releases, look at the reviews. I feel like because it's releasing after two games that were wildly successful, with Enshrouded, which had 1 million copies sold in 4 days, Palworld, which had 12 million copies sold and 7 million more players on Game Pass within the first 2 weeks. Those games were wildly successful, and while they weren't perfect, they felt far more polished and far more along in terms of their development process than Nightingale does. And honestly, that's really concerning for me, because looking at the developers of those two games, those are both indie developers. The Nightingale developers, like I said, worked formerly for AAA studios. I was expecting a really polished game, really smooth gameplay, everything being responsive, much better enemy AI, and overall, right now, I'm really concerned that Nightingale is going to end up just being it rightfully probably if it plays the same way as it did in the stress test. If that was the most recent build, I think it's going to be scored pretty harshly. And it's probably going to be scored even worse because of it's coming off the heels of those other two games, which were extremely polished for what they were and extremely successful. So anyway, those are my thoughts on Nightingale and the fact that it's coming out in just 2 weeks. Let me know if you played the stress test down below and if you plan on playing it on release. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.